All right, so Chapter 17, Angiography and Interventional Procedures. So angiography is radiographic exam of blood vessels following injection of positive contrast media. And right here they're showing lateral carotid arteriogram. This is probably something that you're never going to see in the department. Most of this goes to CT, but we're going to take kind of a quick look at it. So, circulatory system. This is something that you're going to have to know as far as this entire circulatory system and lymphatic system. So, the cardiovascular system, the heart, the blood, and vessels that transport the blood, has three functions. So, function one right here is transport of oxygen, nutrients, hormones, and chemicals necessary for normal body activity. Okay, so that's function one. Function two right here, removal of waste products through the kidneys and the lungs. And then three is the maintenance of body temperature and water and your electrolyte balance. Okay, and then our lymphatic system is lymphatic vessels, and your nodes. So we'll touch base on all of these as we go along here. So the cardiovascular system is a division made. The division may be divided further into cardio, so circulation within the heart, and then vascular, which is your blood vessels. The vascular or vessel component is divided into pulmonary, so the heart to the lungs and back, and general, so general or systemic, which is throughout the body. Okay? So our cardiovascular circulation, we know that we take blood that is not oxygenated and it is reoxygenated. So the deoxygenated blood returns to the heart through the venous system. So through the venous system, which is deoxygenated. So this has oxygen, and this has no oxygen. Okay? So once it has oxygen, it runs out, it goes through the arteries, it goes to the arterioles, into the capillaries where the exchange is made, from the capillaries to the venule, from the venule to the vein, from the vein back into the heart. So vessels that transport oxygenated blood from the heart to tissues are called arteries. So oxygenated arteries. Deoxygenated is veins. So blood components, we know that our blood is made of different components. So our erythrocytes are our red blood cells. They're produced in the red marrow of certain bones, okay? And they transport oxygen by protein hemoglobin to the body tissues. So the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin and then it's transported to the body. So leukocytes, the white blood cells, they're formed in the bone marrow and lymph tissue, so bone marrow and lymph, and they defend the body against infection and disease, okay? So against infection and disease, so the white blood cells. Thrombocytes or platelets, originating from bone marrow, repair tears in blood vessel walls and promote blood clotting. So promote blood clotting, and then they also promote repairs in the blood vessels. The bone marrow is a soft, fatty tissue inside the bones. It's where the blood cells are produced and where they develop. So red bone marrow can be found in flat bones, such as your hip bone or your breastbone, your skull, your ribs, your shoulder blades. Those are all the places where red bone marrow can be found. The main bone marrow of the body producing of all the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So It's the main bone marrow located within those flat bones, hip bones, breastbone, skull, ribs. Yellow bone marrow, on the other hand, can be found in the hollow interior of your long bones, such as your legs and your arms. So your tibia, fibia, your femur, your radius, your ulnar, your humerus. That's where you're going to find your yellow bone marrow. It's made up of fat cells and have an important function in the body. It serves the body's natural energy as the body's natural energy and blood reserve. Okay, so yellow in your long bones and then red bone marrow in your flat bones. So your pulmonary circulation, and I can't stress this enough, you will have to know the flow of the blood through the heart. So start drawing it, start writing it, whatever you have to do. The superior and inferior vena cava empty the returning deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. So from the inferior and superior vena cava into the right atrium, okay? So into the right atrium. The heart pumps this deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries, so right atrium to the right ventricle, and then to the right and left pulmonary arteries, which go into the lungs, where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are changed. So the carbon dioxide is expelled, the oxygen attaches to the hemoglobin, and then it comes back in, which is the oxygenated blood returns through the pulmonary veins. So it comes back from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, and then up into the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, where it bifurcates up into the neck and then down into the descending aorta. Okay, so the elements of the blood vessels, veins, venules, capillaries, arterials, and arteries. They supply the blood to the lungs and back, make up the pulmonary circulation. The arteries generally carry oxygenated blood from the heart to the capillaries. Exception are the pulmonary arteries, which the pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs that has been returned to the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava. The superior and inferior vena cava empty the returning deoxygenated blood into the right atrium of the heart. It pumps out that deoxygenated blood through the right ventricle, just once again explaining it, to the pulmonary arteries, to the lung. The oxygen and CO2 are exchanged, and then that blood returns from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium of the heart. So make sure that you know the flow of blood, and then also the valves. So from the right atrium to the right ventricle valve, which valve, and then from the right ventricle into the pulmonary arteries, what valve does it go through? And we'll get into those as we go along. So your heart and mediastinal vessels, you're seeing here that the heart lies within the mediastinum and rests on the diaphragm. Okay, and you can see that it rests on the diaphragm right here. So the heart's divided into 4 chambers, as you know, the right and left atria and the right and left ventricles. Each chamber functions to receive or pump blood. Okay, so the blood circulation is a closed system by which the unoxygenated blood enters the right atrium from all parts of the body. Pumped out through the right ventricle into the lungs, the reoxygenated blood returned to the body by the left ventricle, and then that's delivered to the various body tissues through the aorta. Okay? So, summary of general systemic circulation. So, the vena cava to the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. which is the unoxygenated blood. And then when it gets oxygenated, the oxygenated blood into the pulmonary arteries, into the left atrium, through the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle, through the aortic valve to the aorta, okay? And then through the rest of the body, okay? Carrying the oxygenated blood that you need. So your heart circulation right here is another diagram of your heart circulation. So you can see your superior vena cava, your inferior vena cava. So those come up. Your superior vena cava comes down. So those come in to your right atrium, okay? Through the tricuspid valve, through that tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle to the pulmonary semilunar, so pulmonary semilunar valve, to the right and left pulmonary arteries. Those go into the lungs, into the left lung, the right lung. The deoxygenated blood is exchanged for oxygenated. They come back in to the pulmonary veins. So the right pulmonary vein, the left pulmonary vein, into the left atrium. Okay, so the left atrium, down to the mitral or the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle, into or through the aortic valve, and into the ascending aorta to where it bifurcates up here, and then down through the descending aorta, carrying oxygenated blood throughout the body. Your coronary arteries that supply blood to the heart, okay, they come off of the aortic bulb. So this is an anterior view. The coronary arteries are the vessels that deliver the blood to the heart muscle, okay? So you have two coronary arteries, the right and left coronary arteries. So here's your left, here's your right coronary artery, and they form off of the aortic bulb, okay? Originating from the aortic bulb or the root, okay, of the aorta. And then those will carry oxygenated blood to the heart. So you have your left coronary artery and your right coronary artery. So if you get blood to the heart, you have to have blood coming back from the heart, okay? So the coronary sinus has three major branches, the great, middle, and small cardiac veins, okay? So here's the middle, here's the small, and here's the great cardiac veins. So great, middle, and small, and they all dump into the coronary sinus, okay? The coronary sinus drains most of the blood from the heart. The coronary sinus system returns the blood to the right atrium for recirculation, okay? So the coronary sinus is a large vein, and it's on the posterior side. So we're looking at the posterior side. So it's on the posterior side of the heart, and it's between the atria and the ventricles. So the coronary sinus, like I said, it has those three major branches, the great over here, the middle, and then the small cardiac vein, which flow into that cardiac sinus, coronary sinus. And then the coronary sinus drains the blood from the heart. So the blood supply to the brain, so now we're on this ascending aorta, this is the aortic arch to the descending, and we get these bifurcations, okay? So we get the right common carotid, the left common carotid. So 2 common carotid arteries supply the anterior circulation of the brain, and 2 vertebral arteries supply the posterior circulation. Okay, so on your right common carotid, you have a right common carotid that you can see it comes up here, and then you've got your right vertebral artery, so that comes down because it's bifurcated off of the right common. Your left common doesn't bifurcate off of the, or your left vertebral, sorry, the left vertebral, which is here, doesn't bifurcate off of the left common carotid, but we'll get to all of that, okay? So the left subclavian artery, okay, is the one that bifurcates and gets the internal jugular, okay? So remember your ABCs, okay? A for aorta, B for brachiocephalic, C for left common carotid, S for left subclavian, okay? So you have your aorta, the aortic arch. You have your brachiocephalic. So your brachiocephalic artery is the first bifurcation there. So your brachiocephalic artery to your right subclavian and your right common carotid. Okay? And then your left subclavian here, left subclavian, but you also have your left common carotid. So you have your brachiocephalic, left common carotid, and left subclavian are the 3 that come off of the aortic arch. Okay? So neck and head arteries. So you're going to identify the vessels A through C. So the right side, right internal carotid. You have the right external carotid. So C right here is going to be your common carotid, your right common carotid. And then you're going to have your external carotid and your internal carotid. Okay? So the internal carotid artery supplies blood primarily to the anterior portion of the brain, and the external carotid artery primarily supplies the anterior neck, the face, and the greater part of the scalp. So that's for your external carotid artery. The internal carotid is the anterior portion of the brain. Okay? So the internal carotid artery, cerebral artery, or internal carotid anterior cerebral artery. So the S shape is your carotid siphon. Okay? So anytime you see this S shape, you should automatically know that that's a siphon and it's your carotid siphon. Your carotid siphon, that's where your blood's returning to, and it goes into your internal carotid artery. Okay? Anterior and middle cerebral arteries. So the 2 end branches of each internal carotid artery are the anterior cerebral and the middle cerebral arteries. So your anterior cerebral artery supplies much of the forebrain near the midline. So anterior cerebral artery, much of the forebrain near the midline. The middle cerebral artery supplies the lateral aspects of the anterior cerebral circulation. Okay, so here's your middle cerebral artery up here, your internal carotid. So it's siphoning through the carotid sinus to the internal carotid artery. And here's your anterior cerebral artery. So anterior, and then your middle cerebral artery. So internal carotid angiogram visualizes anterior and middle cerebral arteries. So internal carotid angiogram visualizes anterior and middle cerebral arteries. Vertebrobasilar arteries. The vertebral arteries join together at the base of the skull to form the basilar artery. Okay, so right and left vertebral arteries, right and left, form the basal artery. So right and left come in to join and create the basilar artery. Okay, so left parietal, your dorsum sellae, your clivus. So that's where they run to supply the rest of the brain. Okay? Your arterial circle of Willis, arterial circle or circle of Willis, you will need to know these. So know that you have your vertebral arteries, your right and left vertebral arteries that form the basilar artery, and it rests on the clivus. From the basilar artery, you create the posterior cerebral artery. So a right and left cerebral artery. And then you run into the posterior communicating artery, posterior communicating artery, posterior communicating artery, to the middle cerebral artery and the internal carotid artery. Start coming back around to the anterior cerebral artery. You have the anterior communicating. So this little one here is a communicating vein to the anterior cerebral artery. So right and left anterior. And then those continue on. The space in here is the region of the hypophysis, the pituitary gland, and sella turcica. So that's what sets in here, okay? That's what these veins go around, is the pituitary gland and the sella turcica. So the posterior brain circulation communicates with the anterior circulation along the base of the brain in the arterial circle or the circle of Willis. So arterial circle or circle of Willis. Certain aneurysms may occur in these vessels that make up the arterial circle, and they need to be well demonstrated on cerebral angiographic studies. The important master gland, the hypophysis, the pituitary gland, and its surrounding bony structure, the sella turcica, are located within that arterial circle like we talked about. Okay, right in there. So our vertebrobasilar arteriogram is when you're visualizing the vertebral arteries, the basal arteries, and the posterior cerebral arteries, okay? So that's the vertebrobasilar arteriogram. I'm going to stop right here because the next one starts on the veins of the neck. So this is most of the arteries. So I will post this one and I'll start on the other one.